Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series for workforce education. Today, we are going to be discussing how to survive an OCR investigation. The presentation will be brought to you by myself, Kassie Toerner. I'm a Senior Risk Management Representative at TMLT. I will be joined by my co-host, Bryant, the Manager of Products and Development and Consulting Services at TMLT. And we are especially pleased to be joined by Dr. Sean Gilby today, our guest speaker. As you know, or if you've participated in the past, you will see the downloadable pod to your bottom left corner. Please feel free to download the presentation and some other resources that are in that pod. Also, if you have a question at any time throughout the presentation, please feel free to put it into the Q&A pod, which is located on the right-hand side of the screen. Ooh, getting a little excited. So before we begin, just a disclaimer for you all to take a moment to review the material presented in this webinar as supplemental and should not be referred to as a legal source. So today we are going to briefly look at an OCR investigation and what that includes: discovery, reporting, investigation, mitigation, resolution, and impacts to a practice and a physician. So here we have a brief timeline that describes the breach that we're going to discuss today with Dr. Gilby, and you can see that it began in September of 2017 and it ended in November of 2017, it started in 2016, and I am going to let him briefly describe to you all the breach that he experienced at his practice.
So we found out in the summer of 2016, actually by my office staff. So I guess I'll back up. So my office staff, when they were using their different patient documents, were leaving the patient documents on their desk at night before going home. And when they were done with those patient documents, some of my staff, rather than putting them in the secure document shredder, were putting them in a box at their desk. And then when they had enough in their box, they would take all those materials and then put it in the dedicated shredder. And we found out in the summer when we came in one day that all of a sudden some documents on one of my office staff's desks were gone, and the cleaning service had come in and thought that because the documents were on the desk that they were trash and should be thrown away. And this, when we researched into it some more, it had been going on for actually several months, for probably about 3 months. So that's how all this got started.
Great, thank you for sharing that. We're going to go through some more steps here.
So the first thing that's important in any cyber incident, whether it's a privacy incident with paper or a security incident with electronic protected health information, is it's really important to report that cyber claim to TMLT or whoever your cyber insurance carrier is. Just curious, were you aware that you had cyber insurance?
We weren't, so we called the TMLT immediately when we found out what had happened, and we did, thank goodness. Then they put us in contact with NAS, who provided the backup for the cyber insurance, and I'll let you.
Sure. Well, and NAS, or now Tokyo Marine, actually is our party that helps us do the cyber insurance, because that's not our specialty. So after you reported the breach, you were assigned an attorney, mm-hmm. and ultimately it was determined that a breach notification to the federal government was required. Mm-hmm. And I think your attorney actually did that for you. I don't think
she did.
Your office did that. Yeah. But in the event that anyone has never seen the page, it's a very simple form to complete. You kind of go through the steps, and there's actually a downloadable PDF, and we've included that as a resource of all the questions that you have to answer when you actually do a report to the OCR. So, can you tell us what happened after the report was filed?
So the first thing was that we had to make sure that what happened would not happen again immediately. So there was some immediate re-education of my staff about if you're done with any paper that has patient information on it, it has to immediately go into the shredding box and nowhere else. And the other policy we instituted right away that there was no paper with any patient information at all left out on anyone's desk when we went home at night. So after that, the lawyer submitted the information to the OCR, and then we started getting requests for further information. So the first set of information that they requested was what were our HIPAA policies? What did we have in place?
We're going to go through those in just a minute. Specifically, did any patients call your office after they got the breach notification letters?
So as part of the breach notification, because we potentially had a large number of patients that had information exposed, we had to send out a notice, and then there also had to be a public notice in a paper. So yes, we did have patients that called the office, and then we had probably honestly more patients that were coming in for routine visits that would say, hey, I got this letter in the mail, can you tell me what went on?
Okay. Yeah, because we often hear that patients think it might be some sort of spam or something that they're getting notified of. Did you ever actually, just out of curiosity, look at the OCR website when the notice was actually posted that you were under investigation?
No.
Okay. Just curious.
No.
Don't blame you. So here is one of the letters that Dr. Gilby received, and we just wanted to highlight a couple of portions on this letter that was sent to him, highlighting what they were looking for, they being the OCR. They were basically saying that there were 6 violations that would be under investigation for this particular breach, and that they were going to look for his compliance with the HIPAA rules as it related to the above reported breach, which he already shared with us. We will mention that his breach was on the smaller side, and even though it was smaller, they still cited 6 violations to that they were going to look into. And one other thing that we wanted to just point out from this letter, the last paragraph, the OCR says that they will work with the practice to receive a resolution. However, if there's not cooperation from the practice, then the OCR will seek other avenues to initiate formal enforcement actions, and this could include civil money penalties and or criminal penalties enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice. And some of the things that Dr. Gilby was asked for, which he's already alluded to, were also included in a data request from him from the OCR. And so they were looking for his internal investigation, his corrective action plan, training, as he mentioned, to staff, safeguards that were implemented as a result of the incident, his media notification, I'm getting a little ahead, and then terminations of services with the vendor that was throwing out the trash. So, Dr. Gilby, tell us what it was like to get that first letter from the OCR and requesting the information, and just what you felt about that.
I mean, honestly, it was terrifying. It happened on a Thursday or Friday, and then immediately after we called the TMLT, within hours, I was called by the lawyer from NAS, which made me feel much at ease. But I mean, when you get that first letter, you're thinking, oh my gosh, they're gonna the fine could put us out of business. We've got to report this. What are the patients going to think? What's going to be the reputation of our practice? How are we going to get through this? I mean, it was overwhelming.
And do you feel like you lost time in your practice?
As a result of this?
As a result
Absolutely.
of the time that you spent dealing with the Office of Civil Rights attorneys,
yes.
etc.
Yes.
And what about financial impact? Did you feel, I know you mentioned that a little bit.
Most of it was covered by our insurance policy, but there was obviously expense by the time you um, take time to deal with all this and then all the notifications and things like that. So it wasn't an inexpensive proposition, but compared to what it could have been if we had been fined, would have been much worse.
Sure. We already mentioned a little bit before about written policies and procedures and a risk assessment. This was something that the OCR requested of you. Were you aware that you needed those in place prior to this, and what did you do after?
So I thought we had a HIPAA policy in place by just saying that, there was no information with confidential patient information exchanged insecurely, and that you couldn't use it inappropriately. We had some written policies in place. I had no idea that there were 90 some odd different formal policies in place, or that had to be in place.
So you took it on to get those written and put
Yes.
them in place pretty quickly.
Yes.
Which was quite an undertaking.
Yes.
And your risk assessment as well, you did that as well.
Yes.
And that was something that you weren't aware that you...
That's correct. So, and I think the first thing we didn't realize too was that there's a risk assessment that's required for the MIPS. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. That's different than what is required by HIPAA, which we didn't, again, that was not something that I was aware of.
Sure. That's a common misconception that we run across, that MIPS is satisfactory for what the OCR is looking for, and it falls short of what they're looking for.
So then some 10 months later, and I think several letters, I think there were several exchanges of letters back and forth between your attorney and the OCR requesting some follow-up information. But about 10 months later, you get the good letter, the letter that notifies you that the OCR is actually closing your case. Tell us how that felt.
It was a huge relief. It seemed like every time the OCR was asking for additional information, I was getting emailed or called by the lawyer on a Friday or during vacations, on weekends. So it was constant. So it was a big relief to be done. But going through the process, I think I also realized how much it was to keep up with, and how much it was going to take to avoid have this happening again. Because it was clearly our fault that this happened, but it wasn't an intentional breach by any stretch, and it was honestly furthest from my mind that that a cleaning company would have thought that papers on your desk were supposed to be put in the trash. So again, how it even happened was kind of surreal to us.
How did you go about selecting the next cleaning company? How did you reinforce what you wanted done?
So we called multiple other practices to find out who they used, and then I personally called the head of the company and said, are you aware of HIPAA? Do you know what HIPAA is? Do you understand what you can and can't touch in an office? Do you understand that nothing can be thrown away unless it's in a garbage can? And then again, we talk over and over again with my office staff that if there's anything that they're still using that has patient information, that it goes in their desk before they leave, and that anything that they're done with goes in a dedicated shredding box, so that there was no way that something could be taken off of a desk accidentally.
I think one of the things the OCR looks at very closely is those immediate mitigation steps. Yes, it took several months to get the policies and procedures in place and some of the other things. But the important things that you did, those little things like firing the first cleaning crew and doing due diligence on hiring another crew, went a long way towards their ultimate settlement.
So what would you say was the most challenging part of the investigation?
There was a lot of requests for different documentation. So we didn't have all of our documentation in one location, even though we had held meetings about HIPAA and what HIPAA was and things like that. I didn't have it centralized in one area, so trying to get all those together, because I think at one point they had asked for the last 2 years of documentation of staff training in our meetings, so that was probably the most challenging. And then there was always a follow-up letter, a follow-up question to what we submitted. So it was a challenge to constantly answer these other questions. It seemed like every time we submitted what they asked for, they were asking for something else.
And after experiencing this, for those folks who are listening or maybe going through this, what's your best piece of advice if they are facing an OCR investigation?
So obviously be honest, because I feel like they looked much more favorably in us being honest in our lack of what we had, rather than trying to make something up. And then keep track of everything in one location, so that if you ever get audited or you need it, it's there. And then the effort that we put in to try and make corrective actions.
Well, Dr. Gilby, we thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your experience with us. And we have the downloadable information on the pod there on the bottom left, as we mentioned. If anyone has a question, please feel free to put it into the Q&A pod, or you can send questions to consulting@tmlt.org as well.
While we're waiting to see if any questions come in, I would remind you that all of the webinars are recorded and are available on the Resource Hub at tmlt.org. If you have questions, of course, you can submit those at any time to consulting@tmlt.org. Are there any questions coming in, Cassie?
I don't see any questions coming in, so we would like to thank you for your time today. Oh, one question just came in. Can we bring the patient list to home when you try to finish your work at home? I'm assuming it's a paper.
So technically you can, but that patient information, again, is confidential. So you're risking leaving it at home or getting it lost to and from work, and then you're responsible for that. So, we have a strict policy in our office that there is no patient information that's taken out of the office whatsoever. All of our charting is done electronically, so we can remotely log in from home to finish charting, but there's we have, again, strict policy that we don't risk that by allowing it to go home.
And I think that part of the HIPAA privacy rule is that you have to safeguard even the paper. Mm-hmm. So you're exactly right. If you do take it home, there's a huge risk involved.
So what references can we use to guide us in making sure that our HIPAA policies are up to date and compliant? We can all chime in on this one. The OCR, their HHA's website, offers some policies and procedures of what they're looking for specifically in the laws that are outlined there. It does get a bit confusing. There are other resources available for policies and procedures. I'll let Cathy speak to some of those, or even you, Dr. Gilby.
Well, Kassie helped our group come up with the formal policies and procedures. And then we asked the TMLT to come in, I think it's every 2 years or 3 years, as part of our practice review, to go through those with us. We've had outside firms do our, I've forgotten what it's called, but it's the testing to make sure that there's no electronic breach available or potential. So we've used a lot of consulting services to help with that.
I think the complete list would be found in the OCR's audit tool, but as Cassie said, that's very cumbersome to get through. I might suggest you tune into the January webinar, which is surviving the, I'm sorry, not surviving. That's what we're on today, which is that the webinar is going to be on, it's time for your annual HIPAA checkup. And we're going to go through the basics of those policies. And I think the date is wrong on that slide. It's January the 28th, I believe. Just as a reminder, we certainly appreciate all of your time in joining us today, and that our next webinar is on January the 28th. If you have any questions, again, we're more than happy to answer those. But we thank you for joining our webinar today and taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. And Dr. Gilby, thank you especially for sharing your experience.
You're welcome.